原子力ガバナンスに対して批評をする立場であられると思います。そして私は社会学者として皆様の行為を観察するというふうになるわけです。ちょっと私が本来なら観客となって皆様の講演を見せていただくことに専念するべきかもしれませんが、そして原子力ガバナンスはさまざまな機関を使い、原子力をエネルギーの安全、エネルギー確保のために使っています。もちろん軍事目的というものもありますが、これはタブーとして議論することもありません。そこには原子力ガバナンスの中で発電所の事業者と規制当局が混在をしているわけですが、これは原子力のロビー団体もしくは原子力村というものまでは入れられないと思います。私は彼らは原子力マフィアだと思っています。もちろん今申し上げたような呼び名でも構わないと思うんですけれども、ただ原子力ガバナンスの他のメンバーのことを考えるとマフィアという言い方はふさわしくないと思います。これは後でまた説明をしますけれども、もう少し中立的な言い方があると思います。原子力マフィアとか原子力村ではない言い方があると思います。そしてクリティーク、批判する側ですけれども、多くの NGO があります。3.11 前からあった NGO もあれば、その後に誕生したものもあります。このカンファレンスもそうですよね。そして私にとって原発の作業員にとって重要なポイントは何かというと、大きな組合がありません。日本には連合という大きな労働組合があります。世界でも有数の規模を誇る組合ですが、連合は一切官庁との交渉には関わっていません。
Negotiations that have been launched by very small, not labor unions, but what I call labor NGOs.
労働組合というよりか労働 NGO というような労働者の労働条件や労働環境、そしてその声なき労働者を代弁しようという、そして組合などにも代弁されない労働者たちを代弁しているような NGO が出てきました。これらの機関がですね、政府、そして厚生労働省と主に交渉を始めました。そして経産省とも交渉があったわけです。3.11 以降ですね、このような団体がこのような会議を持っていました。
Look at the way they interact with the government is that
政府とのやり取りというのを見ますと、
these guys
これら
girls are the one who bring fresh information of what is going on at 福島第一。
福島第一原発での最新の情報というのを伝えてくれているわけです。他の誰よりも政府の職員よりも現地の情報を把握しているわけです。政府は大体把握していない状況を把握していなくて、新しいニュースに驚くというような光景が見られました。
Maybe it's ambiguous sometimes. And so those labor activists they ask very harsh questions, and they are making a very developing a very rational critique of the current situation, and they put pressure on the government to
批判を政府に対して投げかけてきていました。そして状況を改善するように行動を取るようにということで呼びかけてきたわけです。
This is the way they interact.
このような会話が実際起こっていたわけです。
日本語ない。こんな感じですね。And another striking point is that they are very small groups, but if they write letter to TEPCO, they got answers.
大変小さな小グループではあるんですけれども、東電に対して直接書簡を出す、でそれに対して回答を得ているという、実際のグループがここに写真で写ってあります。でこのような小さな団体にもかかわらず回答を得ているということを私、感銘を受けました。で、本題に入りまして、放射線保護ということでお話をしますと、現在、原発労働者で50ミリシーベルト以下の累積線量を受けた人々に対しては、フォローアップ、健康管理はなされていない。
Another point is that there is so far no recourse, and that's a decision from TEPCO and the ministry, that there will be no recourse for internal radiation below 2 millisieverts.
これ2ミリシーベルト以下の場合は内部被爆に
So
関して
far,
も
there
記
is
録
no
なしとい
systematic
う状況です
dosimetry, nor health follow-ups for the people employed in the
福島県内のホットスポット
decontamination work
で除染活動を
on
行
the
っている人
hotspots
々
of Fukushima
に対し
prefecture.
ては全
That's another
くその
big
組
part
織だ
of
っ
the
た
problem.
占領系に対するの測定
Activists
は
also
行われて
claim
いま
that
せん。
workers should be given the right of an access to
労働者
the
というのは
epidemiological
そ
survey
もそも
planned by TEPCO and the Ministry of Health and Labor
政府、厚生労
on the
働省
huge
とそして
cohorts
東電が
of
行っている
20,000
疫
workers.
学調査の
The pro-
アク
now
セ
the
ス権
problem
利
of
を得
this
るべきであると
survey
いうふう
that
に言えま
it
しょ
has
う。
been limited
この調査
on purpose
におき
by
ま
the
してはです
ministry
ね、意図的に
to the workers who have been employed at Fukushima Daiichi
福
from
島
March
第
11
一
to
に3月
December
11日から
2011.
そして
It means that they won't care about the
12
workers
月
who have
ま
been
でその
employed there
2011年のその期
afterwards.
間のみ
which is
働いた
another
人々
problem.
しか対象にしてないという大変意図的なその制約が設けられていました。
So the question, the way those surveys are being conducted,
調査
they,
のあり
they
方に
question the
関して
production
も問
of
題があるわけです。
knowledge
そしてこの調査の方法論を見ますと
radiation regarding the workers.
労働者の被爆に関しての知識が限定的になっているという状況がございます。そして松本宮尾先生が日本の構造祭という本を大変関心深い本を書いているんですけれども、そこから引用しますと間違ったデータの
So I think these labor activists are doing a very important job
構造債を長期的にもたらしていると言っているわけです。ということで、
Now let's go to
この長期的なデータが蓄積されていないという問題があるわけなんです。
the hermeneutics.
そしてその低線量の解釈学についてトピックを移してお話ししたいと思います。
So the nuclear governance and its critique disagree not necessarily on the purpose of conducting surveys,
その批判者たちはその調査のあり方、特に疫学調査のやり方について
Fukushima citizens may be
意見
used
が
as
食い違っているわけではありません。ただ福島
And this is why they want to
の
keep an eye on the method,
労
the
働者、
purpose, the
原
kind
子
of
力労
data
働者たち
collected.
はモルモットとして活用されているというリスクがあ
When
る
the
と言いまし
surveys
ょう。
have been conducted and the
だ
results
からこそこの
published
方法論に目を光らせておいて、そのデータの収集のあり方というのに
on the
監視がなされて
interpretation of
いる
these
わけです。
results.
そしてその結果の解釈というところについてもお話をしなければなりません。
The philosophers call
哲学の
the
世界では
interpretation task, they call that
解釈
hermeneutics.
学というふう
It is
に
the
言ってい
science
ま
of
す。
interpreting documents,
データ、文章、
all sort of knowledge.
知識をどう解釈するかという
So
学問
regarding
です
the discussion and conflicts of interpretations,
解釈
the
につい
hermeneutics
て
of radiation
対
protection
立があ
on
る。
low doses,
特に低線量の解釈に対立があるということに
To
関
what
しましては、
extent
次のような対立が考えられます。まず 3.11
has created a new context
で
that could
ど
lead
のように
to
新
the
たな
further
コンテクスト
modification
が
of
生まれ、
current
それによ
standards
って現
of
行の
radio protection.
放射線保護の
What will be the
基準が
specific
変わる可
role
能
of
性がどのように出てきた
epidemiological
かということ、
research
そして
on
2つ目
nuclear
の
plant
問いとし
workers?
ては、原
And of
発労
course, the
働
influence
者
of
に
those
関する
surveys
疫
for
学調
the
査の
average
そ
citizen.
こで果たすべき特定の役割とは何かということです。
So, you know this Professor Yamashita Shunichi,
山
don't you?
下先生については皆さんご存知のことと思います。
You know his famous slogan,
有名
okay?
なスローガンについてもご存知ですね。
Below 100 millisieverts,
100
there
ミ
is
リシ
no
ーベル
worry.
ト以下では
No
問
need
題
to
ない。
worry,
心
okay?
配する必要はない
And
という
you
ふう
know
に
the
言っているわけで
reaction
す。
of many
そして
of
それに
you.
対しての反論、リアクションというのも皆さんも同じような意見だと思います。
I think,
さて、
well, this is a controversy, okay?
Ma,
And this is
このような
one-to-one, okay? Looks
論
like
争が起こっている
fair
わけ
deal,
です。
like you have
意見の対立というのがある。一方がこう言って他方がこういう意見が対立するということが起こりうるわけです。これが論争と言われる典型的なシチュエーションであると言えます。けれどもこの論争というのはですね、海外の専門家も参画しているわけです。そしてこの状況の解明におきましては ICRP、WHO 等々の国際機関も関わってきているわけです。ミシェル・フェルネックス先生、クリラッドの方々などの
Professor Baverstock who is here
ババーストック先生に関しては今回参加されています。
so on. I think CSRP is part of the whole thing, okay? The question is, your understanding of the situation, is it like this? For example, is it like the voice of the nuclear governance is much stronger than the voice of the critique? Or is it rather like this? Like, oh, sorry. So, ちょっと時間のズレがある。Sorry. So is it like this? Like the voice of the nuclear governance is stronger, or is it? Or is it like this? The voice of the critic is stronger. Okay, you got it? Wow. Now, and this is one reason why I prefer to talk of nuclear governance instead of nuclear lobby. One reason is that within the nuclear establishment, within the Genpatsumura, you have people like Professor Toshitsu Kosako, who made a declaration, who made a statement about how dangerous an exposure is to 20 millisieverts a year. And interesting point for regarding nuclear plant workers that he made a comparison with this average of exposure to the current, to the average citizen and the children. He made a comparison with this level of exposure with the current level of exposure of nuclear plant workers or uranium mines. And if you look at the data before 311, you will see that he's right. I mean, only a very few number of, very small number of workers have been exposed to doses, year doses of 20 millisieverts. Actually, even in Fukushima Daiichi, which is one of the most, which was one of the most contaminated because very old plant, you had, I mean, officially, you had no worker who have been exposed to 20 millisieverts before the disaster. Of course, after that it changed, but.わかりました。ズレがあるね。ごめんなさい。そうかそうか。わかりました。So the fact is that now in Fukushima, children, in Fukushima now children wear film badges. Okay. And dosimeters, just like NPP workers. The city clocks give not only time. City clock はこれですね。まあいいか。The city clock gives not only time but also the background radiation level. The citizens are asked to manage their radiation protection. ごめんなさい。Fukushima Prefecture has become a vast controlled zone. 管理区域 is the way to name the part of the nuclear plant which is most exposed to radiation. Okay, so Fukushima has become a controlled zone, while the rest of Japan is more or less out of control. What a crazy situation! But there is a risk of that we get used to this situation. And this is where we need artists. Artists, film conductor will provoke us to look at reality differently. Actually, this movie, I guess you have seen it, is I think it plays with the fact that women have been criticized as hysteric. You know, the women, they don't know about these complicated things like radiation. They are crazy, and so on. And also, it's a way to draw the attention on this discourse by the nuclear governance on radiophobia, resilience, and so on and so on. You know that Professor Shigenobu Nagataki has expressed publicly views that are not far from the views of Professor Yamashita Shunichi. Actually, Yamashita-san is was student of Professor Nagataki, or they had this kind of relation. I had an occasion to meet him, and I asked him his opinion on the statement by Professor Kosako, the statement that Professor Kosako made on April 2001. And he said, oh, well, you know, Professor Kosako regrets his statement, the statement about the 20 millisievert level dose exposure. So, well, I wanted to check with Professor Kosako himself, so I visited him, and he said, no, absolutely no regret. So, well, this shows one thing, that this guy is a true liar, okay? And second thing, so this is more complicated with Professor Kosako, but let me do it shortly. I mean, we can discuss later. Another thing when I visited Professor Nagataki is that he made also harsh critiques on Professor Elizabeth Cardis. She has been the head of the Department of Radiation Health Effects at AARC. It's the research center on cancers located in France, but it's part of WHO. And well, one of her major contribution of Professor Cardis was her direction of large survey on NPP workers. It's a very huge surveys on 15 countries, and she was the head of this program. The results were published in several articles, and a particularly groundbreaking one was published in the British Medical Journal in 2005, and it showed slight increase of cancer mortality for workers with cumulative dose of 100 millisievert. But only a slight increase, and the conclusion of this article did not recommend a change of the current standards of radio protection. So, I'm sociologist. So those things, I have difficulties to understand those papers. Okay, but I do my best. Thank you. But for a layman like me, I thought this paper wasn't a big deal. So I thought, what's wrong with Professor Nagataki? Why is he so critical of this survey? And it took me time to understand that for him, this slight increase of mortality was just too much. He couldn't afford it. He couldn't bear it. So I asked Professor Cardis an interview, and she kindly explained, and so I visited her, she's now located in a research center in Spain, and she kindly explained to me the limitations of the epidemiological methodology. I mean, that's a thing we can discuss later, when perhaps Professor Babestock can help us to understand this, but epidemiology has intrinsic methodological constraints. And for example, an important one is what statisticians and epidemiologists call the confidence intervals. And well, it's kind of joke, but I would say epidemiologists believe in confidence intervals. I don't know how far Professor Baverstock and other epidemiologists believe to this, but that's the point we cannot ignore. Okay, and another point is Professor Cardis has also participated in the, I guess many of you knows this report. I think there is a Japanese translation now. The famous so-called definitive reports on Chernobyl. Okay, actually Professor Yamashita Shunichi was also co-author of this report. And in the frame of an interview, I understood that she has been in a very tricky situation, that she had to present this report in Geneva. But on the previous day, IAEA made a presentation of this report. And they presented this report their own way, in a way that will reduce the communication, the risk communication. That's risk communication. But is that risk communication, or is that marketing and marketing lies? That's the trick. So I think she has been cheated on this, okay? Okay, so I'd be glad to hear Professor Baverstock as used to work with Professor Cardis years ago, so maybe I think he can have some interesting comment on this. By the way, Professor Nagataki, this was in last August in Japan. There was a conference on, forgot, but it was in Japan, and Professor Nagataki was there, and he was contested during this conference with the government. And actually, Professor Tsuda was there also. Are you here, Professor Tsuda? Tsuda sensei, まだ来てないんですか? じゃあ、まあ、まだいないか. Well, but I know he was there, so maybe he will comment on this also. Conclusion. Where exactly is the critique? At what step is it? And what are its effects? So, I will give you now a cartography of the flows of critique. Who criticize who and for what reason? Now, I cannot go in the details of for what reason, but just to give you a flows of the critique. So we have seen, I make a distinction between the nuclear governance and the critique of the nuclear governance, or what we can call the nuclear critique. So we have seen Professor Yamashita, the IAEA, Professor Nagataki. Well, I would put the Prime Minister there. Oh, this is what we call, so far we could call this the nuclear mafia, okay? I would be okay with that. But I would be uncomfortable to range Professor Kosako within a nuclear mafia. I don't think it's just not his type, okay? And neither Professor Cardis. It doesn't match so this is why I would prefer the more neutral term of nuclear governance to define this group. And they have connections. Professor Baverstock used to be on that side, the nuclear governance, but for some reasons that he has explained already, he has tended to shift it toward the nuclear critique. Tsuda sensei, I think we can put Professor Tsuda here, and so on. I go quickly. Professor Koide-san, Iwata-san, Tachi, and Ishimaru Koshiro was among the rare nuclear opponents to the nuclear plants in Fukushima, Daiichi, Daini, before 311, and now he lives in Iwaki. Oh, here you have the politicians from Shaminto, the Social Democrat Party, and the Communist Party is representative in Iwaki City of the Communist Party. Both of them are very committed for the situation of the nuclear plant workers and, of course, the situation after 311. So here you have the politics. Oh, over there also, but here the politics on the critical side, okay? And Yamamoto Taro, and, well, Koizumi and Hosokawa, they used to be over there and shifted here, there, okay? Now let's see the flows of the critique. The CSRP will criticize the nuclear governance, okay? But also, I guess they are critique of, I mean, I guess mainly they don't care about you, but just. And you have also these flows of critique. We have seen that Professor Kosako was critical about the decision made by those guys over there. And, well, you can have also these flows. Oh, sorry. These flows of critique. And also, within the critique, nuclear critique, you have a lot of criticism of each other. For example, that's for historical reason. The Social Democratic Party used to be the Socialist Party, has complicated relation with the Communist Party. For, you would say, oh, they are all leftist, but no, for them they have different political tradition, way of organizing themselves and expressing themselves. So. And I guess also among the opponents to nuclear energy, all those who are critical to the current situation of radiation protection and so on. You have so many different views, and people will be critical to each other, okay? And, well, this is also what we call debate, controversy. So, let me conclude the conclusion with this remark. As my professor Boltanski, in his book On the Critique, has argued, the role of the institution is to assess the real. It means to repeat again and again what things really are and how we should interpret science and turn it into policies. Then comes the critique to challenge this version. Oh, you say things are like this, but come on, is it really what you say? So the critique will question the reality of what it is. Is it really what you say? Okay. So the role of the critique is to reopen other possible outcomes. Does science really say so? If science doesn't really say so, you cannot deduct these policies. So I hope this fourth session of the CSRP will once again reopen the possible outcomes and the interpretations on low doses radiation and their health effects. Now, as this first panel is about information, let me finish by an information. On December 15, on the coming December 15, there will be a conference organized by the Nuclear Governance, and it will be about low doses. So it might be interesting, so if some of you could attend, I myself won't be in Japan, so I hope some of you can attend, take some record, or even if you can put on the video on the web, that would be very nice. I would appreciate. Thank you very much for attention. Thank you very much. どうもご清聴ありがとうございました。
ジョバンさんどうもありがとうございました。社会学者として私たちを観察する役割 だと思うんですけど、今日は私たちを観察する社会学者のジョバンさんを観察させていただきました。いくつか面白い視点がプレゼントされていると思うんですけども、今まで割とその、脱原発とであと原発推進っていうの、脱原発イコール、被爆を気にしていて、で原発推進イコール被爆は問題ないとしてっていう、このなんか2項だけのこう対立になってたのが、それが、また別の項が本来ならあるはずでというビジョンをちょっと見せていただいたような気がするんですけど、ただ原子力ガバナンスとそのガバナンスのクリティックという話があったんですけども、じゃあ原子力ガバナンスをガバナンスするのは誰だっていうのが今また問題になってるんじゃないかなというふうには思ってるんですけど、これまたちょっとディスカッションの方で、あるいは明日の円卓の方でお話しさせていただければと思います。次はですね、おしどりまこさん、吉本の芸人さんで、2011年の3月以降からジャーナリスト活動、私が知る限りでもですね、この原発事故の後のこのジャーナリズム活動を本当に包括的に、おそらく、東電からこの規制委員会から、福島県の県民健康調査からで環境省の専門家会議、そして、厚労省でやっている労働者の疫学調査に関する会議など、いろんなところでお見かけして、おそらく日本で一番カバーしているジャーナリストではないかと思います。では原発事故3年半の現実、スライドがちょっとまだですかね。いいですか、はい、じゃあお願いします。
皆さんおはようございます。おしどりまこと言います。よろしくお願いします。ありがとうございます。先ほどご紹介していただいた通り、私はその原発事故の取材に関してといいますか、2011年原発事故があってから取材を始めたので、とてもビギナー新人なんですね。なのでこのセッション、情報とメディアで話す機会をいただくということはとてもおこがましいと思っています。おこがましいってどういう英語なんでしょうね、ちなみに。でも新人ということは大変に今回に関しては私はメリットがあると思っていて、一つはこの報道という日本の原発事故における報道というものに対してすごくフレッシュな目でものを眺めることができたということで、もう一つはそうですね、あまり失うものがないので自由にものを言えるということで、一番新人ということは情報の受け手読者に一番近い立場で取材をできるということが私は大変メリットがあると思っています。でそれで原発事故の後から取材を始めまして、私が見たこと感じたことを今日皆さんにお話ししようと思います。追いつきましたね。ありがとうございます。で今日お話しすることはいろいろな、情報の歪み、報道の歪み、そして3年半見てきまして、それを歪みを正すことはできるのかどうかというのも考えて、その提案をしたいと思います。まず1つ目は原発事故の報道の歪み。少し私早口ですね。ゆっくり喋ります。すいません。原発事故の報道の歪み。そうですね。私は2011年から取材を始めまして、いろいろなものを見ました。スポンサーの問題。日本はとても電力会社が強いので、テレビやラジオ、雑誌ではあまり先輩の記者の方々は自由にものを言えないようでした。そしてもちろん国からの圧力、これが意外とあるんですね、なんとなく。で、スポンサーの問題と国からの圧力がありますと、メディアは自主規制を言われなくてもしていくようになってしまいます。そして3点目の問題として、新人の私が言うのは本当におこがましいんですけれども、記者の方々の知識が乏しいというのはとても残念なことになっていると思います。で具体例をお話しいたします。いろいろどの新聞社、どのテレビ局、どの雑誌がこういう圧力を受けたというのはまた聞きで直接記者の方々から聞くんですけれども、そういう風の噂みたいな話ではなく、直接私たちに起こったこと、おしどりに起こったことをお話ししようと思います。2011年にいろいろ雑誌に記事を、週刊誌や月刊誌にいろいろ記事を書きますと、電事連と呼ばれる電力事業連合会と呼ばれる 電力会社の連合会ですね、そこから編集長の方に圧力が来ました。で、電磁連というのは雑誌社に対して大変広告料という形で意見を言えるんですね。で、編集長に2011年におしどりの記事を1回載せるなら原子力推進の記事を3回載せろと、それでバランスを取れという指示が来たんですね。で、担当の記者さんと話をしていて、これ1対3だとバランス取れないですよねという話をして、で、2011年に原子力推進の記事が3倍載るというのはとても嫌なことだったので、編集の方と話し合って記事を取り下げました。で、それで2011年は載らずに、では2012年の3月に、原発事故から1年目ということで、その時期に載せようという話になったんですが、また同じように電磁連の方から、今度はカラーのすごく綺麗な全国の桜を紹介するという広告が挟み込まれて、結果私たちの記事は載りませんでした。で、そうですね、そういう電磁連の圧力もあります。そして広告会社による圧力、これは私たちが2011年にテレビやラジオで、原発のこと、東京電力のことを取材をしている内容を話すというときに、広告会社の方からおしどりをテレビに出すな、テレビで原発と東電という単語を一切出させるなという
if she's going to be featured, she should not mention any certain keywords. By the way, my husband and my colleague here is not taking my picture right now. But anyway, I am also a comedian as well. And sometimes I'm on the TV, I go to Tokyo, but I got the clear instruction not to talk about the nuclear power accident if I'm featured on the television as a comedian, with the promise that I will not mention the actual program name or the broadcasting company's name. I was talking about this to other people, but then a few months later, that program itself disappeared. It was discontinued. So this was the actual pressure that I have perceived. In terms of other pressure, there's another pressure from local electric companies. I am also a comedian at the same time being a journalist. So as a comedian, I would go to different parts of Japan, like Toyama Prefecture, and if I'm on the stage there, then I get a phone call from the local power company, like from Toyama, asking the stage manager or the stage producer about myself. What kind of comedian is she? Well, a bit of a complaint. Well, the local power companies have a tremendous power and influence locally. So the producers who decide not to use me, they don't know the real reasons, but they don't want to use someone who gets inquiries from local electric companies. And I'm just giving these like 3 examples, but actually I think that the influence is much, much greater. Maybe I have lost so many jobs, much more than I have recounted here. I'd like to talk a bit more about the pressure from the Japanese government as well. This is an excerpt from the screens from the Ministry of Environment. I'm sorry, the font is quite small, but what it says here is that it's the retort from the Ministry of Environment regarding Television Asahi's program on Hodo Station journalistic program that was featured on March 11, 2014. They talk about the thyroid screening that is undertaking in Fukushima Prefecture. I myself actually have a friendly relationship with the producers of Hodo Station, the news station. So I participated as well in actually introducing people that they can interview. But unfortunately, that particular director who was in charge of this program committed suicide this year. I know that there has been quite a lot of struggle, but it's quite surprising that there is a specific complaint from the Ministry of Environment on a particular TV program that was featured that talks about thyroid screening. That director actually was very proactive in criticizing and looking at the realities of the power plant and the radiation influence. Right before the broadcast broadcasting of this program, he has told me that he received requests from various people in power requesting him not to broadcast that program. So I was talking about this director who committed suicide. Well, what did I perceive as a pressure from the government? Well, year, suddenly someone was following me. This person, I thought he was a fan of mine. Well, actually, when I discovered that he was part of the coastal research organization, which is part of the government, I thought from someone who used to work for that agency, but anyway, Japan and Japanese government has been trying to restart the nuclear power. That was officially decided last summer, and since fall, environment and the nuclear regulatory agencies as well. So many people from these actually government organizations helped me, which is a very welcome situation, and I'm grateful. And the reason why they are willing to help me is because I like to study and I like to research thoroughly. I'm not influenced by any sponsors, and I really want to know the truth. That's why people who are working in the PR and communications department of government agencies would contact me and actually commission me to write article, and something like that happened this year as well. People from Ministry of Agriculture, for example, has provided me information. However, this year we will have the enactment of the Secret Information Protection Act, and once this is in place, I fear that they will not be able to provide me the information. Many of these PR people from government tells me that maybe this is the last bit of information that they can provide me. METI people also communicate with me as well. And Professor Kosako from Tokyo University is also someone that helped me. And likewise for the METI people, even the nuclear promoters say that they need nuclear power for Japan, but that said, the actions and the stances that has been taken post March 11th Fukushima accident is should not be condoned. That's what they're saying. So in a way, there is the pro-nuclear side and against nuclear critics, which is creating a very difficult situation. Fortunately, I was helped by a lot of people until now, but once this Information Protection Act gets enacted, I fear that it will be abused.
記者の方々の知識が乏しい、もうこれは本当に言うのがおこがましいんですけれども、これを2011年9月10日の、東京電力と海電庁の写真です。現在はどうかと言いますと、同じ日付の写真があるので、このような形で、2011年ですね、とても取材する記者の数が減っています。で、その上、大手メディアの記者の方々は、定期的に入れ替わるんですね。短いところで3ヶ月、半年ぐらいで新しい方々が来られます。ということはどういうことかと言いますと、とても本当に引き継ぎとかもあまりされない感じで、もう初心者の方が取材しに来られるんですね。私がびっくりしましたのは、去年2013年の夏に新しく来られた方が、東京電力の記者会見で質問されたことが、通信社の方だったんですけれども、ホールボディカウンターで内部被曝は測定できるんですかという質問を去年の夏、原発事故から2年になったことにされました。私はそれはとても驚いて、もうそのようなことを2011年の4月5月にとても出尽くして、そして汚染地域の方々はもう常識のことを改めて通信社の方が2年後に質問してしまう。で、それで記者会見で質問される人数が少なく、このように記者会見が終わった後、ぶら下がりという形で、広報の方にいろいろ質問するんですけれども、その時の質問が新しい方は、
And those who are new to the problem, solely for that, but the available questions is very low. Even in 2014 or 2013, those who are new to this, the pressure vessel and container vessel, which is inside. Oh, such a stupid question. It's very bad. The report that, for instance, there was a problem of the investigator paper of Yoshida related to the Asahi newspaper, and there is no person from Asahi, and they were totally new people coming to the press conference. And what happens for all everything from the TEPCO after the completion of the press conference of the TEPCO, there is a lecture for the ABC of radiation. It's really interesting because maybe it's nuisance to TEPCO, and now the employee of TEPCO instructs the mass media, said that they have to refer to the website of the TEPCO, and then the TEPCO employees said that you have to take a look at the contamination water task force site, and then the mass media asked what is it, and then the TEPCO explains the relationships between the METI and the task force. It's really good to have new people because we have to retain the new perspectives. However, they have to do homework to cover such really technical issues, and whenever I have a press conference, I keenly feel that the mass media has to study and does the homework. And this is my impression. In addition to that, there is a distortion in the original information issued by the mass media. For instance, suppose that there is an information issued at the press conference, and sometimes those information is different from what happened actually, and sometimes the really important fact is hidden. For example, this is employee of TEPCO, and in 2012, at the Fukushima NPP, he served as a nurse at the medical room. His name is Sumemori, and in 2013 he quit TEPCO in 2013, and I have the privilege to have an interview with Mr. Sumemori. Mr. Sumemori said that whatever information about Tokyo electric company, as this number of the Daiichi NPP is limited to those who died in the premise of NPP. That means that those who died out of the overtime work and the outside of the premise of the NPP was not counted as a death case. For example, if the person lived and the neighbors of the NPP, then if the person died, however, that person was not counted as the death caused by the NPP work. For example, the other worker may go back to their hometown and the weekend, and then that person may not come back on Monday to work or report for because of the death. However, that person died outside of the NPP, therefore he is not counted as a death caused by the NPP work. So this is a really serious situation, and there are many concerns among workers, and there is a report to a certain degree because Mr. Sunemori is a nurse in the medical office, and therefore he has a report. For example, one person died in the morning today. However, then when Mr. Sunemori reported that to the supervisor determined that there was an underlying disease that killed that person. Therefore, this person's death was not counted as an NPP-related loss. With the rotation, Mr. Sunemori worked several times a week, and there were 4 nurses in the same situation. And in 2012, Mr. Sunemori worked in the medical office of the Fukushima NPP, and he said he got about 10 cases of such. Therefore, the nurses like him got the similar number of reports. If we assume that way, the number who was not disclosed is a really concern to him, because there must be more death cases caused by the NPP work. Then in September 2014, the way TEPCO discloses information is the same. For example, in September, there's a person transferred by the Dr. Chopper. As to this case, TEPCO said that there was no relationships between the work he's done and the symptoms he developed, and there was no detailed disclosure. In addition to that, he worked only 6 months at the Daiichi NPP. That's why TEPCO insisted that there was no relationship at all. However, the person transferred in Dr. Chopper was working in Fukushima NPP in 2011 and 2012. In addition to that, that person worked for the decontamination in Naraha town, and he has reported already the 80 millisieverts. However, the official report said that the cause of the death is aortic aneurysm. In addition to that, in August 2014, another person died, and this person, before the morning briefing, he died, and this is out of the official working hour. That's why this person's death was not counted. However, when I interviewed this reason, there is a dissection of the aorta of the heart, and this was not disclosed by TEPCO. However, right now workers suffer from CV diseases such as heart diseases, and many of them died, and some of them are hospitalized because of the heart diseases. And of course, the details of the diseases as well as the exposure dose was not disclosed at all. And TEPCO only insists that there's no relationships whatsoever between their cause, the diseases and their work. However, many papers assume that there must be some relationships or causality between the diseases developed by workers and those. However, there is no official report at the press conference. Therefore, if the mass media does not have a direct connection with the workers in the Fukushima NPP, the mass media cannot get any information. And there is a problem, that is a restriction of the mass media. For instance, on May 16th in 2011, this is the notice issued by the NECHI, and it's next to universities and research institutions across Japan. And the point here is that when conducting health surveys and studies on disaster victims and the disaster affected areas, avoid duplicate work and be considerate so as not to conduct more detailed surveys and studies than necessary. I knew this in the Idate village in Fukushima, which was a heavily contaminated area. And for those people, they want to know the information as soon as possible, and they want to have a whole encounter for their children as soon as possible. And in order to realize that they had worked in 2011, and the half-life is very short, for 8 days. Therefore, children are exposed to iodine. must have a whole body counter to measure the dose level, and the parents are really busy for that, and they visited the administrative offices, universities, and research institutions, and the whole body counter is difficult to obtain. Then they even said that they would go to the very far away to obtain a whole body counter as soon as possible for their children, and they pleaded over and over and over again, and people on the field wanted to obtain the whole body counter for children. However, it couldn't, and then this notice was presented. Because of this notice, the people wanted to take a whole body counter. However, because of the notice, the detailed work and studies were prohibited. And then in the village of Itate, in the initial phase, there is a doctor working in the Itate village. However, after this notification, doctor said he could not do any study at all, and he had to get many clearances, and it's almost impossible to do anything to study, and he had to evacuate from the contaminated Itate village without doing anything. And then I visited the next to get the information. However, the next insisted that there's no prohibition, there's no restriction. It's just that avoid. We did not we don't instruct. They should not study. It's a really voluntary avoidance of the study. However, similar notices were issued over and over again, but it related to agencies. For example, this is one example issued by the MAF, Ministry of Agriculture, and this notification was issued to the retailers such as supermarkets. And it says, please take consideration in regards to such matters as labeling of origins. See, suppose suddenly the labeling of the origin of the source of a vegetable changed. Up until one point, the source of origin was the such and such prefecture. However, after one day, the Japan made. However, labeling is different from a supermarket to supermarket, and I see their struggles because some supermarket uses such labeling as the Western Japan made produces. However, the government of Japan insists there is no specific instruction. However, if such a notification was issued, it's natural for the retailers to have a voluntary restriction. Now, this is another example. In March, May, and April in 2011, there were many contaminated vegetables in Fukushima Prefecture. The research institutions in the private sector, as well as the universities, can measure the radiation dose by using the dosimeter. However, the dose level was not disclosed, therefore we didn't know how much exposure we got. Just one researcher or one research institution could not disclose such information, although measurement was conducted, and there's only one organization that discloses the dose radiation information, that is Greenpeace. However, this is limited to Fukushima Prefecture, meaning that how much radiation contamination happened, such as in Tokyo, Kanagawa, and so on. It's really hard to see. However, you see at the direct sales point in Fukushima Prefecture, the several thousands of becquerel or several tens of thousands of becquerel contaminated spinaches were sold. There were many manufacturers going to the private sector laboratories, and they have asked them to measure. And they have put all of the materials on the measurement. However, unfortunately, the data was not disclosed. Why? Think about it. The company pays money to get a measurement. However, it's really the protest against the government of Japan, because government of Japan says that there's no worry about that. However, they voluntarily take the measurement. So in order not to be challenged by the government of Japan, the private companies did not disclose the dosage information, although they did take a measurement. Then in 2012, at the Tokyo University, there was an OECD Nuclear Energy Agency meeting. And I covered this symposium. There were 3-day symposium. And I found Yomiuri and Oshidori are the only two mass media who covered this symposium, and then I or we were the only agency who covered this symposium. ICRP dialogue seminars and many information presented at the symposium. However, most shocking to me is this.
福島の住民の方々の話
Those
を
who
聞い
live
て、
in Fukushima,
福島の方々は新しい価値観に出会えたと。それは故
they
郷を愛する価
insisted
値観だ
that
と。
the Fukushima
福島の
president
方
found a
々
new
は
value
自分
system
たちの
that
手
is
で
a
除
love
染して
to
住み続
dear
けたいという
homeland.
選択をした
That's
ということ
why
が
they
その
determined
シン
to
ポジウムで
decontaminate their towns. And this is now frequently
この結
referred
論を
phrases
外に
in
出す
this
とか、
symposium.
これは私が取材した内容と違うなとだいぶ
And
思っていたんで
I
すけれど
believe
も、
this is different from what I heard
まあ
with
私
my
たちが
own
プレス
ears.
席で取材をしております
However,
と、
when I
研
covered
究者の方が
the
人に
mass
近づいてき
media
て、どういう記事を
seats
書くの
and
ということを
one
話し
of
にか
the
けてきたん
related
ですね。
people
で、この
approached
シンポ
me
ジウムの
asking
目
me
的はこう
what
だから、ちゃんとそれを踏まえ
the
て書いてね
coverage
と言われたんです
I
が、
going
それが
to
このシン
write.
ポジウムの目
And
的は、
he said that
世界
I had
に
to
原
be
発を
based
推
the
進してい
fact
くため
I
に、
heard.
どうやって
However,
住民に
in
リ
order
スク
to
を説
promote
明してい
nuclear
くか。
power
もうこの時点
generation,
でアフリカやアジアに
how
原
we
発を
get
作っていく
the
ことに決
public
まっているので、
acceptance
すでに
with
原発事故
Fukushima
が起
people
こった
because
時に
it's
どうする
already
か。
done
そして
deal
福島の原発事故の
to
リスクを
construct
住民が受け入れ
NPP
て、
in
除
many
染して
other
進むという
countries.
発信、
Therefore,
それを発信するこ
we
と
have
が
to disseminate the
世界
information
に
that
アフリカやアジア
all
に
we
原
have
発
to
を作
do
るた
right
めにす
now
ごく
is
重要
to
なことなんです。
decontamination work.
それを踏ま
And
えて
this
記
will
事
be
を
all
書
the
く
more
よ
important
と
to
出席
promote
した日
nuclear
本の
power
研究者の方
generation.
から言われま
This
し
is
た。
a remark
で、
by
まあ
the
私は
Japanese
分かりま
researcher
した。
attended
そ
this
の通りに書
symposium.
きますと言っ
I
て、
said,
全
yes,
文書くと、
alright,
それ
sir.
なんで書くんだって
I'd
いう
write
報告来たん
down
ですけれども、
exactly what you
ま
said.
あ、全部音
However,
源取
of
ったりした
course,
ら、あれ
as
おっし
you
ゃってません
assume,
でした
I
と
got a
いうやり
complaint
取りを
from
した
this
ら、もう何も
researcher.
言われなくなりました。
So I wrote it
で、ま
down
あ、そこ
as
で、
he
福
instructed.
島エイトスという、
Anyway,
安藤涼子さんのスライドも
the
紹介されておられました。で、ここで
prepared
感
by
じた
Aldo
の
Rocco,
は、
and
そ
this was one of
の
the
OECD、
presentations
LBA
at
の
the
シンポジウム
symposium
で
and
発表され
OECD
る住民の方々
symposium.
の意見というのが、
Opinions by
本当
the
に
residents
一種類のものだけだった
of
と
affected
いう違和感だったんですね。
is converted
で、
into
まあ、
one,
福
and
島
it's really
のエイトス
strange.
の方々だけでなく、
Not only
河川地
Fukushima
域、
ethos, but
あちこちにい
all
ろ
of
ん
the
な団体がありま
agents,
す。これはマゲネと
organizations
飯舘
in
という
affected
飯舘村
area. For
の
example,
団
this
体
is
で
an
すね。
example
子ども
of
たちにとに
Magene
か
to
く早く
Itate,
ボルボリカンタを受けさせたいと
NPG,
主張していた
and
方々の団体です。
and
で、これはいわき市で、
NPO
学校給
tried
食
to
で
get
福
the
島
whole
県産の
counter
ものを
measurement
率
for
先して
the
使おうという
children,
のは
and they tried
倫理的
to
におかし
use
くないかというようなことを、署名を集めて活動してお
not
られ
to
る団体
use
の方々
the
ですね。
produces
で、
made
これ
in
はこの間
Fukushima
の日曜
prefecture
日
for the safety
の、
reason.
イベントだったんで
The
すけれ
last
ども、
Sunday there was an
さま
event
ざま
by
な
this
原発事
organization,
故に関
and
するさまざま
as
な
to
裁
the
判
many
や、
NPP accidents, there are
団
many
体があ
rulings
りま
and
す。
courts,
で、その
and
裁
there
判の
are
方
many
々が非
organizations
常に
working
返
for
し
the
て、
anti-NPP.
情報共有してい
And
こう
then
という
all
こと
of
が
those people got
新し
together
く
to
始まったん
share
ですね。
information, and such
それ
a
に参加され
move
ておられた原
started
告団の方
by
々です。
this, and these
たくさん原発事故に関して住民の方々の意見はあるんですけれども、世界に出ていく発表される意見はなぜか一種類に、絞られてし
there
まう
are
というの
many
は
organizations,
発
however,
信
when
され
the
る情報の
information
歪みでは
is
ないかと思います。
disseminated, there was only one voice
さ
because
て、こ
of
の
the
報道の歪
distortion
み、
of
情
the
報
mass
の歪み
media.
は正せ
I
るんでしょ
have
うか。
covered the distortion of the information
まあ、
sharing and
原発
the
事故
mass
の取
media,
材ビギ
and
ナー
how
の
we
私
can
が
correct
一
this.
つ提案したい
I'm a
と思います。
beginner of the nuclear power.
取材をして感じたことは、私たちは本当に舐められてい
But
る
I
ことなんです
say
よね。
that we are
で
looked
実
down
際に私たち
quite a
が
lot.
あまり賢くない
And
と思う
actually, we have to
私
admit
自身
we are
も
not
とて
so
も不勉強
clever,
なので。
including myself, because I had to study
こ
more.
れは、
But we have to
2012
admit
年に
this
週刊文
fact.
春という雑
This
誌で
is the
私が
article
東京電
issued
力
by
の
Shukan
作業員の
Vision in
方が、
2012,
亡
and
くな
it
ったことに
featured
つい
the
て
article
記
written
事を
by
書いた
me
んですね。
about the death
原
of
発作業
an
員は
NPP
なぜ死んだ
worker.
か。
The
まあ、
title
これ
is
も本当
Why
に理不
NPP
尽
worker
で
died.
歪んだ
It's really
内容があったん
irrational,
ですけれ
and
ど
there was
も、
a really lot
こ
of
の記
distortion
事
happened
を
in this
書いて
article.
綱領
And
と
I
いうそ
wrote
の、
the
まあ、これ
article.
ぐらいでもう完成ですよとなった日に、
I presented proofreading
なんか離婚されたんですね。それで電話がかかってきて、申し訳ないけれども作業員が亡くなった記事は減らしてくれと言われたんですね。で、それで、いや、そんな作業員が亡くなったことより浜崎あゆみさんの離婚の方が大切なのかって私はやり取りしたんですけれども、浜崎あゆみさんの離婚を載せないと、その雑誌の部数にも関わるので、悪いけれども消すと言われました。で、これは本当に読者の問題といいますか、浜崎あゆみの離婚より作業員が亡くなった記事を読ませろというふうになればよかったんですけれども、やっぱりそういうわけにはいかず、情報を受け取られてしまったんですね。なので、その情報の受け手としてメディアを淘汰する力というのは持っていると思います。私たちが NHK や報道ステーションやいろいろな新聞やいろいろなメディアにきちんとした情報を出して、この記事が読みたいんだ、この記事はいらないんだということをきちんとものを言っていくということはメディアを淘汰する力になるのではないかと思います。
what we want to
私
see.
が去年ショックだったことの一つ
There's a
に、安倍総理
selection
が
and a
バイ
consideration
ナスアイ
of
レ
the
スへの
good
IOC 総会の時
the
に、汚染水
mass
が
media
汚染水を
domain.
完璧にブロックし
For
ています。
example,
コントロールしてい
the
ます。
Prime Minister
とおっしゃったん
Abe
ですけ
said
ど、
that the contaminated
これ
water
は
is
安倍さんが
completely
一応ブロッ
blocked.
クしてるんじゃないかなと考
And
え
the
たエ
Prime
リアなんです
Minister
ね。
Abe
港湾と
assumed
呼ば
that
れ
this
るこ
area
のエ
is
リアが
blocked. For
0.3 平
example,
方キ
this
ロなんです
is
けど、
0.3
で
square meters.
まあこれはショックでした。なぜなら記者会見ではもう汚染水は毎日海に流れていますというようなことは発表してい
There
た
was
の
the
で、
official report
それを
that
全
said
然
that
そ
the
の
day in and day out
安倍さんが
contaminated
嘘をおっしゃ
water
った
is
ということよ
reversed.
り、その
Therefore,
嘘
this is a
が
lie,
私たち
and
国
this
民に
is
通
not
ると
shocking
思わ
to
れて
me.
いたことの方
However,
がショックだったんですね。
my shock is that this
で
Prime Minister
私たちが
Abe
いやそ
believes
れ
that
は
he
おか
can
しいでしょ
disguise
嘘
the
でしょっ
general
ていうふうにな
public.
らないと思われていた
And
と
the
いうの
Prime
がショッ
Minister
クで、
also believes
ちなみにこの
that there's no
こうブロック
person
してい
in
るとおっ
Japan
しゃった次の日の
raised
東京電
a
力の
challenge
会
to
見は
his
とても荒れ
comment,
て、
and the following
記者の方々が総ツッコミで東京電力に汚染水は本当にブロックしているんですか、そんなことないでしょという質問したんですけど、東京電力もさすがにブロックしているとは言えず、東京電力といたしましても、安倍総理のご発言の趣旨を国に確認いたしましたって言ったんですね。東京電力もびっくりしてたんですよ、あの発言は。なんであんなこと言ったんだ、国に確認したということなので。なので、本当にこれはもう私たちが情報に疎かったので、このようなもうおかしな発言を許してしまったということで、とても悔しかったです。で、私はまあ報道とか情報のいろいろ歪んでるなと思ったんですけれども、でも案外私はチャンスだと思っていて、原発事故に限らずいろいろな問題の歪み、まあ、報道の歪み、情報の歪みはあるんですけれども、全部私たちが情報の受け手がメディアを淘汰して、情報の受け手のレベルを上げることによって、メディアはもう自然に変わらざるを得ないと思うんですよね。で、私が本当に今まで芸人として仕事をして、2011年の事故の後から取材をして勉強を始めたように、たくさんの方々が不勉強だったなと思って動き出された方々もいます。なのでとてもチャンスだと思っています。で、これは、2013年の法医権の国際シンポジウムでアメリカの研究者の方が戦場再構築への提案という中で発表されていて、とても印象的だった言葉なんですけれども、被爆者は事実を知る権利があると。被爆者はどんなに少ない線量でも自分がどれだけ被爆したか知る権利があるという発表を去年されておられました。で、汚染地域の方々に限らず東日本の方々は私は被爆したと思っています。私自身、2011年にホールボディカウンター、詳細なホールボディカウンターを受けたときに、その方が東京の人間にしてはあまり被爆してないという評価をいただきました。なので、もう東京の方々も被爆していますし、それはフランスの研究所のデータでも出ています。実は海外のデータはいろいろ揃っていて、原発事故の後、海外に外国人の方々はすぐ自分の国に戻られたんですよね。で、それぞれの国ですぐにホールボディカウンターを取って行動記録を取っていると。で、その情報提供をするということもその去年の保育園のシンポジウムで発表されていました。しかしまだ日本にはそのデータは手に入っていません。で、まあそれぞれの国で発表されたデータを見ると、例えばフランスは280人の方が3週間以内に日本からフランスに戻っているんですけれども、その 35% の方が被爆していたというデータをも発表しています。で、先ほど申しました通り、その原発事故の直接の被爆でなくても、とても汚染されていた食品が流通していたので、それによる内部被爆というのもかなりしていると思います。なので、まあ本当にこの原発事故に関することは、ただまあ一読者としてではなく、私たちは被爆者として事実を知る権利があるのではないかと思います。で、まあそのために私たちがメディアを淘汰しつつ、そしてこう自分たちの情報のレベルを上げていくということはとても必要なことではないかと思います。長くなりましたが、最後まで聞いていただいてありがとうございました。
眞子さん、どうもありがとうございました。ここで本当は冒頭に説明しなければならなかったんですけども、プログラムパンフレットと一緒に質問用紙というのが配られていると思います。それで、各スピーカーへの質問をそこに書いていただいて、
in a question sheet, please write down your question to each of the presenters on that sheet and hand it to people, one of our staff members. we will collect your questions and consolidate your questions at the very end of the session, at the end of each session. I don't know if we have enough time, and we might not have enough time to cover this today. If possible, and if we receive your question, we'd like to make sure to transmit that to the roundtable discussion tomorrow, so that we can cover and answer your question. If you can tweet as well about this session, and you can submit your question in that way with hashtag CSRP. So you only have one sheet of question sheet, so if you have already used it, you can get another one. You can get as many as you want and submit as many questions as you want. Thank you once again, Ms. Mako Oshidori. So she talked not about information, but I think she talked about trust and confidence on the recipient side and on the information sender side. The situation where there is a lack of information and the situation where there is too much information, I kind of feel sometimes that it's the same thing, basically. And from that perspective, when there is too much information, we need to distinguish what kind of information we need, and we need to select. That's a capability for information screening that we need. And from that perspective, I'd like to introduce the next presenter, who is Professor Kyo Kageura. So far, he has published various books, such as the quantitative analysis of the dynamics and structure of terminologies, and the conditions of trust, words surrounding the nuclear power accident. So that's what he would talk about in terms of the current situation, and he would present us his analysis. Looking forward to your
Thank you very much,
presentation.
Iwata-san. What I'm going to talk about is nuclear discourse after the TEPCO accident. First of all, I have to apologize. The first thing is that the English slide and Japanese slide doesn't.
日本語のスライドと英語のスライドがマッチ
There's
して
a
います
little English slide and Japanese slide. And for those people who are listening to my talk and watching my talk in Japanese slide, please be careful. And I'm sorry about that for interpreters. And another thing is that what I'm talking about is nothing new. In fact, I've talked about it here and there, but the situation still continues. So I still think that it's valid. Okay. You know, it's... sorry? Yeah, 日本語あると思いますけど、ただほとんど一致してます。ほとんど一致してます。はい。ありがとうございます。And in fact, what I'm going to talk about is rather complementary to what Mako-san has just talked about. She delved deeper into what's going on actually in the process of policy making, in the process of risk communication and all these things. But I take distance. I take distance and just observe the disclosure structure en masse, right? And this is the content of my talk. First of all, I'm going to just talk about the boom of risk communication and confirm what is the basic nature of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant disaster. And after that, talk a little bit about the language and laws as social reality. And these three constitute the background. And after that, I get into the post-accidental discourse and analyzing that to some extent in order to clarify why the current situation prevails, and also the wider effect of the disclosure structure, right? So let me start from the first thing. At the beginning of this fiscal year, we heard the news. 11 ministries and agencies requested several billions yen for risk communication. And this year, we are observing many risk communication projects, including government advertisement in newspapers and pamphlets, perhaps. And logic behind this risk communication can be postulated like this. You know, Professor Dr. Nagataki once said, why do ordinary citizens demand zero risk in radiation-related matters? And behind that question lies the assumption that low-level radiation does not cause immediate harm. There are many other risks. Then why do people demand zero risk in the case of radiation, specifically in the case of radiation? Well, perhaps these people are ignorant. And therefore, we need proper and effective risk communication. And we are back to the boom of risk communication. But before getting into analyzing the structure behind the risk communication, let us confirm what exactly was TEPCO Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant disaster. Back in 1986, immediately after the Chernobyl nuclear accident, we had this stated by an official. In Japanese nuclear plant, I had a hydrogen explosion will not occur. Radioactive materials will not be released into the environment. That's what is stated, was explicitly stated by an official in charge of the commercial nuclear plant. And also, up until very recently, the Ministry of Education distributed a pamphlet to junior high school students in which they state these safety measures have a margin that is more sufficient than what can be expected, right? But in 2011, the hydrogen explosion occurred, and a large amount of radioactive materials was released to the environment, right? And the National Diet Independent Investigation Commission released a report in which it states, as for the nature of the nuclear accident or the background of the nuclear disaster, that, and it says this, they either intentionally postponed putting safety measures in place or made decisions based on their organization's self-interest and not in the interest of public safety. And the NAIC report also states this, the government, the regulators, and TEPCO effectively betray the nation's right to be safe from nuclear accident. And what is right to be safe? We have the common level of reference, which is in Japanese constitution, which states in Article 25, all people shall have the right to maintain the minimum standards of wholesome and cultured living. And in all spheres of life, what is more important is that the state shall use its endeavors for the promotion and extension of social welfare and security and of public health, right? And slightly further than that, so from the point of view of that kind of rights, right, a legal scholar stated that the damage is not whether you get the health effect or not, but damage of that they are forced to choose one or the other is already a common damage inflicted on people. So, in a nutshell, the TEPCO nuclear plant disaster, which was caused by the negligence of the government, regulatory bodies, and TEPCO, one, violated citizens' right to be safe, and two, unfortunately, rights are still being violated, as can be manifested by the fact that a large number of people are still unable to return home, and still people are forced to choose without much support. So these are violations of human rights inflicted on people by the government, regulators, and TEPCO, right? So let us go back to the logic behind risk communication, which starts from the question that why do ordinary citizens demand zero risks, right? It's a red herring, as it is not addressed within the framework of the right violations, which is a proper postulation and characterization of the nuclear disaster. So, against this backdrop, I guess the proper question to be addressed is this. How have these misguided discussions unduly come to prevail, right? So this is the topic to which we now turn. But before getting into analyzing the background arrangement of discourse, which enables this kind of question to prevail, let me confirm a little bit about the nature of language and laws as social reality. If you say freeze, I cannot distinguish L and R. Then people freeze. Which means that language in general is binding. And to the same extent, laws are binding as well. And not because their violations lead to punishment, but because they are binding. I'm sorry about that. And more importantly, individual utterances and legal tokens make sense, personally and socially, on the basis of this deontic nature of language and laws. Right. But precisely because language, laws, and probably money and other things constitute a social reality, but not the natural reality. There's a fragile aspect in it. It's a fragile existence because massive misuse of language and utterances can destroy the linguistic, legal, and social infrastructure and can introduce unhealthy relationship among actors, conceal the real issues to be addressed, and relativize truth in the flood of lies and nonsense, right? So up to here, I've finished explaining the background before getting into the analysis of the arrangement of this causal structure. First, we confirmed that we are observing a boom in risk communication, and just confirmed and checked the nature of the accident, upon which we just raised the suspicion to the situation of risk communication. And as a side kind of topic, I just introduced the status of language and laws. Now what remains to be addressed is the post-accidental discourse. That is the main content, but that discourse does not only affect the nuclear discourse as such, but has a wider socio-political effect, to which I also turn. Anyway, and after that, in the end, we will go back to the risk communication. Right? So the post-accident discourse, unduly appropriated. Well, putting the conclusions first, we are observing three main issues related to the post-accidental discourse. It has established an arrangement of communication in which perpetrators give opinion to victims, and in which those who are responsible have restricted the disclosure agenda to radiation, which has effectively downplayed the social and rights issues. And the third and last, within which so-called radiation experts has provided a plethora of scientifically unfounded claims, mostly downplaying the risk of radiation. Right. So let's check the first issue. This is what we saw, what the Prime Minister's office released on 20th of March 2011 to the residents in Kanto and Tohoku area. Rain will cause no health effects. Rain will cause no health effects, be reassured. Okay, that's what we had. Of course, government has a responsibility to take care of people's, citizens' health and other things. So to that extent, it's not violating their role anyway. But after that, we have observed the massive bombardment of similar calls by government and experts to people. Like, no problem, no immediate health effects, smoking is more dangerous, you cannot assure zero risks anyway, stress is more hazardous. And on and on. But who are these people who told us that stress is more hazardous, there's no risks, nothing to worry about? These people are, according to NIC report, the government, the regulators, and TEPCO, who have effectively betrayed the nation's right to be safe from nuclear accidents, right? So exactly these people, the same people have been talking to us that it's safe. Okay. So, but unfortunately, they are the ones who talked, who spoke up. So those who are responsible for the accident secure the position to impose their opinions on victims. So this is a basic background structure, which was an arrangement of discourse that they defined. Unfortunately, which in a nutshell perpetrators make decisions and they decide things on victims' behalf. Something's wrong with that. And the second aspect of the post-accident discourse is that the topic agenda is narrowly restricted to the issues of radiation, right? The government, media, and experts have been talking about the issues of potential health risks of radiation as if this is the single most important issue. Mostly, this assumption, underlying assumption is unstated. They just keep talking about health risks, well, at the same time downplaying the health risks, but some honest and naive people explicitly state it. And here comes the professor of philosophy called Dr. Professor Masaki Ichinose. And he stated in the year of 2011, he stated this: chronic exposure to low dose radiation will cause death by cancer. The largest issue, the largest cause of worry for us, which hangs like a black cloud above us, is no more and no less this proposition. And he also went on to say this, but why are people worried about this, while no physical harm has yet to become apparent? Right? Recall the nature of the TEPCO accident. According to the NIC report, the government, the regulators, and TEPCO effectively betrayed the nation's right to be safe from nuclear accidents. That's the first thing, and it's not only the health issues, but the very fact that they're forced to choose one or the other, whether they stay or they move, all the other choices, is a common damage inflicted on people by the accident. And going back to Professor Ichinose's statement, suppose that somebody splashed water on you in the street and you get angry and worried. And here comes the professor of philosophy with a serious expression, but probably no serious thought or no thought whatsoever for that matter, and said, but why are you worried about this when no physical harm is yet to become apparent? Do we not call this, have we not called this, is the modernity taught us to say that this is sort of the second harassment, But these things prevail going on and on. And in addition to that, where the discourse on health effects is duly misleading. First of all, I've already talked about it. The health issue was detached from the wider context of human rights violations inflicted on people by the negligence of the government and TEPCO. That's the first thing. The second thing is definition of health was trivialized by restricting it to physical damage. And this is not my opinion. This is actually not my opinion. This is what we should be talking about because the WHO states, and this statement is legally binding in Japan because Japan ratified WHO statute in 1951. First of all, WHO states that good health is a state of complete physical, social, and mental well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity, right? So that is the first point. And in addition to that, if you look at the WHO website, it clearly says that health is a fundamental human right, recognized in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So what I've talked about has nothing to do with my personal opinion. I just refer to the some sort of regulation, legally binding statements, and deduce the argument from that. Right? The third point of the post-accidental discourse is that after that, first, the people who are responsible for the accident secure the opportunity to talk, one. Two, they restricted the disclosure agenda to the narrow sense of health. Then within that discussion, so-called radiation expert has provided a plethora of scientifically unfounded claims, mostly downplaying the risk of radiation. And we are going back to what I've already introduced, a massive bombardment of scientifically unfounded and often, too often, just outright false claims like this. Sea fish do not concentrate radioactive iodine because they retain iodine in their body. That's stated by Professor Dr. Keiichi Nakagawa of the University of Tokyo Hospital. But immediately after that, the baby lance fishes are found to contain a huge amount of radioactive iodine. And no negative health effects occur below 100 millisievert, which is now well refuted. So, all in all, the post-accidental discourse has established this sort of arrangement. So first of all, those who are responsible kept the position to talk to people, make decisions pretending that they are on the people's behalf. People who raise voice against this has become marked, right? And lead to the suppression of the legal framework agreed by the society. And discussions were unduly restricted to radiation, with the misguided definition of health, with the effect of concealing the issues of human rights and right-related issues, and within the discussion, or within the discourse of health effects, overriding scientific knowledge by political terms. Right? That's what happened. And projections is that, well, within this kind of disclosure arrangement, it is most probably the case that responsibilities remain unaddressed and problem personalized. Right. And this disclosure arrangement has wider effect, in fact, than what is immediately concerned with, which is the topics related to nuclear disaster. So first of all, we observed this. In May 3rd, 2011, Professor Shunichi Yamashita stated in his talk like this: what is at stake here in Fukushima now is to what extent we can keep this 1 millisievert restriction, referring to the ordinary people's restriction of the dose, right? Annual dose. And in last year, at the beginning of, no, could be not June, but January, but I'm sorry about that, Professor Emeritus Otsura stated, it is a matter of course that laws in ordinary situations do not hold in an emergency situations, both of which are not really true. To change laws and regulations without due process because they are violated is not legally valid. You know, if gangsters start fighting each other, and a lot of gangsters started owning guns, and the prohibition of the owning guns are violated. And then if the lawmaker says that let's change the law so that people can have guns, which is not the way. Anyway. And we have, in relation to these issues, the existing guiding principles, like the GH Miami Declaration, 15 years ago, we affirmed the prevention of exposure is the single most effective means of protecting children against environmental threats. And also, the basic environment plan, which is regulatory binding, and the fourth basic environmental plan was reaffirmed just this year, which states a lack of scientific knowledge does not justify delay in implementing due measures. We should implement preventive measures while at the same time endeavoring to enhance our scientific knowledge, right? So this is not what I said. This is what the government and ministries say, right? But, and we have to confirm here that language, laws and regulations, preventive policies, limit of additional laws, potential dose over certain amount in control areas, whatever so-called experts say the government says, these policies and regulations are still binding. They are still binding, you know. But unfortunately, because language and laws are not the natural reality, but they are social reality, the collective erosion of these leads us to somewhere weird. Like due to the massive erosion of the deontic nature of language and laws, we now have unfounded claims prevail, semi-legal claims prevail, and outright right prevails, all serving as a basis of socio-political planning and decision-making, or perhaps lack thereof. And we are observing this factual nonsense, the declaration of back to normality following the nuclear accident, contaminated water is completely blocked, which Mako-san had already referred to. The situation is completely under control, both issued by Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Right. So, in fact, taking advantage of the emergency situation we are observing now, that the deontic nature of language and laws are being eroded, right? So what happened? Summing up what happened? Responsibilities, well, let's forget them because we are in emergency. Laws and regulations, well, let's forget them as we are in an emergency. Science, forget it as we are experts and we are in an emergency, right? Then here comes the end conclusion. Emergency, forget it. Because after ignoring responsibilities, laws and regulations and science, there's nothing to worry about. You know, there's absolutely nothing to worry about in this emergency situation. So retrospectively going back, we are observing responsible administrations on the basis of these semi-legal policies and unscientific claims. And these are the examples of these. Back to normality, contaminated water is completely blocked. The situation is completely under control. It is a matter, of course, that laws in ordinary situations do not hold in an emergency situation. It's not a matter, of course, at all. And no negative health effects occur below 100 millisievert. It is not probable that the current occurrence of thyroid cancer are due to radiation exposure. And all these unfounded, unconfirmed claims. And some can talk like this. We can conclude that this nuclear accident kindly reminded us of the fact that we live a limited time of life full of risks. I sincerely hope that Japanese turn this order into something positive, which is stated by Professor Keiichi Nakagawa. But somehow, however, some worried and complaining people remain who perhaps fail to forget responsibilities, laws, and scientific opinions. Now, as these annoying issues exist no more, because we've forgotten everything conveniently, the problem should be solved by making these complaining creatures recognize that we are living in a limited time of life full of risks. Thusly, the answer is communication and going back to what we are in now. Well, it's almost the end of my talk. Generally speaking, from the point of view of the deontic nature of language and laws as a social reality, in a desert which lacks the deontic nature of language and laws, a farrago of fantasies, trivial lies, and nonsense prevails. And it is accompanied by responsible administration, sub-legal policies, and series of unscientific claims. And risk communication, or travesty thereof, plays an important role here to cover up these fantasies, responsibilities, and sub-legalities, and unscientificities, right? Unfortunately, as Mako-san pointed out, many mainstream media at large colluded with this, perhaps unconsciously, but sometimes consciously, probably. And we are here now. I dare not say it is safe about the Sendai Genpatsu. It's Dr. Shuichi Tanaka. Then the Prime Minister Shinzo Abe stated that nuclear plants shall not be restarted unless 100% safety is guaranteed. And then the Minister of Economy, Trade and Industry, Yuichi Miyazawa, stated, after seeing blah, 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 it's going ahead, but 100% safety is not possible. And the governor of Kagoshima Prefecture says that they are now ready to restart the nuclear plant. Thank you very much for your attention.
どうもありがとうございました。二次ハラスメントという言葉はすごく痛感したんですけども、今現在のそのリスクコミュニケーションというのが実際に被災者の方々に、二次ハラスメントの状況というのがある。でこのリスクコミュニケーションというタームが、本来は良いものでも悪いものでもない言葉であるはずなんですけども、今実際に行われているこのリスクコミュニケーションの問題、またそれをスティグマ化していく 今現在のその政策あるいは専門家の方針というのをまた明日円卓会議のディスカッション2の方で、話をしていきたいと思います。皆さんとても自由なんでスライドが入れ替わったりとかですね、順番が入れ替わったりとかしてちょっとスタッフの方も対応が整わず、どうもすみません。それで、最後のセッション1の最後のスピーカーは、カイル・クリーブランドさんで、彼と会ったのは2012年郡山で IAEA と、日本政府の国際会議があったんですけども、その中でを知りました。でそのペーパーについては当時日本政府とアメリカ政府がどのようなやり取りをしてでどのような意思決定をそれぞれに反映させていったか、あるいはまたその EU の日本大使館それぞれがどのような意思決定を行っていったかといったようなことをまとめたペーパーであったんですけども、今日はちょっと我々が、日本に住んでいる我々が知らないまた視点なんかも、紹介していただけるんではないかと思います。それではクリームドさんよろしくお願いします。
Thank you, Wataru, for organizing this conference, and apologies for the confusion on the timing. I'm a sociologist at Temple University's Japan campus, and my starting point for my research on this topic was that I am the study abroad advisor for a group of several hundred international students. We have about 800 undergraduate students, and about half of those are American and international students. And like any other university or organization at the time, we were trying to figure out just exactly what was happening and how to deal with this. And so I, as the nuclear crisis in the first week started to amplify and become much worse, we were all trying to figure out exactly what was going on. And eventually, on March 20th, I accompanied an emergency departure, effectively an evacuation flight to Hong Kong with a group of students that made their way back to the United States. And after that, I started doing research, and since 2011 have interviewed about 230 people, including people in the American government, the Japanese government, the US military, the Japanese SDF. I think what's a little different about my work than some of the other colleagues here is that my work focuses more on institutional actors and more on the way the US government in particular was dealing with the nuclear crisis. I've written 2 papers about this. One is in Japan Focus. The Japan Focus, which is an online journal, has a paper called Mobilizing Nuclear Bias, which is the subject matter of this, and also in the journal Critical Asian Studies, a related paper that summarizes this research and what I will talk about today. From the very beginning, we were talking about and trying to figure out what everyone else was, which was just how bad this was, how dangerous it was, particularly in the first couple of weeks of the crisis, as we were trying to deal with our crisis management at our university. And of course, like everyone else, we were seeing what was on in the media. The media was very alarmist. And I think ironically, some of what were taken as an overreaction or a panic in the first couple of weeks of the crisis subsequently have been vindicated to be in some ways quite reasonable claims and worries. As more information has become revealed, as government reports have been written, as Freedom of Information Act documents have become available, as various governments and organizations, including the NRC, have written their after action and lessons learned reports. What those reports, even official reports, have demonstrated is that the situation was really quite more serious at the time than certainly what the government was saying and certainly what TEPCO was saying at the time. My starting point for my research was looking into the government's Freedom of Information Act documents. I was very surprised to see that there was a big difference within the United States government as they were trying to determine just how bad this was. And what I realized in those documents is that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which is the American government's main organization for dealing with nuclear issues, was recommending a 50-mile or 80-kilometer exclusionary zone. This was in stark contrast to the Japanese government's recommendation of 30 kilometers. And also, I was very interested to see that the U.S. Navy, the Pacific Command, and particularly naval reactors, was recommending a 200-mile exclusionary zone. So that's a rather profound gap between 30 kilometers on the one hand with the Japanese government, 80 kilometers from the NRC, and then eventually something like over 300 kilometers for the U.S. Navy. And I was trying to figure out just why they had these differences. Now in the media, the discussion of this, ironically, was comparing this to almost like a nuclear explosion, and that was vindicated or demonstrated by the outer structures of the various reactors exploding in turn over the first week or so. But ironically, aside from the staff at the Daiichi plant, maybe some of the very first people who were hit by the radioactive plume were sailors who were on the United States Ronald Reagan Carrier Strike Group. This is a nuclear aircraft carrier, and it's a flotilla of other support ships. They had gone to Korea for a mission and were coming back to Japan to work on tsunami efforts. And on March 13th, they detected the plume at about 132 miles distance from the Daiichi plant. And in the FOIA documents, these government documents, they demonstrate that these government officials, these nuclear experts in the U.S. Navy, were very concerned about the levels that they were reading. They were indicating that they were about 30 times above background level and that they would exceed a protective action guideline criteria within about a 10-hour period. This is something that subsequently has become a legal issue. And now in the United States, in San Diego, about 230 claimants that were sailors on the U.S. Ronald Reagan have brought a class action lawsuit against TEPCO initially, and now several other companies involved in the design of those reactors. That's an ongoing case that still is in the courts. The reason the United States Navy had recommended a 200-mile exclusionary zone was that the Yokosuka Naval Base is about 163 miles from the Daiichi plant. And so ironically, at the same time that the Ronald Reagan aircraft carrier was detecting nuclear plume, the George Washington aircraft carrier, which was ported down near Yokosuka, was also detecting a plume. And the results that they were getting were really quite alarming to them. This is in contrast to the information that the Japanese government had available at the time. What the Japanese government was making available was primarily just information that was from fixed radiation monitoring posts distributed throughout Japan. They're close to the plant. I think there are 19 down in Yokosuka. And the only information that foreign governments, I've talked to the British ambassador, Sir David Warren, also the US government, the only information that they were really getting from the Japanese government was from a streaming website on the MEXT website that had this data from these fixed radiation monitoring posts. We all recall that in that first several days, there was very little information coming from TEPCO. They were changing what they were saying almost hourly, several times a day. And so I think very quickly, the United States government and other governments realized that they weren't getting very meaningful information from the Japanese government. These posts, eventually, they were able to acquire and compile this data. It's still available online. But initially, this wasn't really processed data. So what the United States government was doing was using various kinds of computer models, feeding this data from the fixed radiation monitoring post into these computer models to come up with analysis. Of course, we all know about SPEEDY, which was the Japanese government's atmospheric modeling system that was not properly used, and now they've decided not to use it at all. But at the time, this was a great scandal because Baba Tomatsu, who was the mayor of Namie, his citizens were evacuated right into the path of the plume, and now he has sued the Japanese government and has claimed that it was a case of institutional murder. I've interviewed Baba-san twice, and he said that he initially found out about the nuclear disaster by watching it on TV. This is tragic and ironic given the fact that Namie is only less than 10 kilometers from the Daiichi plant, and they had had long-standing drills to deal with this. And when it came down to it, he found out about it by watching on TV. I interviewed the mayor of Yokosuka last week. He also said that he found out about the nuclear disaster by watching it on TV. So the best laid plans of men and institutions in a crisis situation seemingly don't really work very well. This is Baba-san about a year after, And one thing I just want to point out here is the emotional toll that this has had upon Baba. This is Baba in 2011, this is Baba in 2012, and this is Baba just a couple of months ago. And you can see that the stress is having a real effect upon his health. I feel very worried about Baba-san. He basically has not really had a day off since this disaster started. And the Namie story is still a story, I think, that is to be told. I think by now we know that one of the ways that the Japanese public learned about the Speedy issue was through a Tokyo University physics professor, Hayano Ryugyo, who is chair of the Department of Physics at Tokyo University. He went to Suzuki Kan, who was the Minister of MEXT in charge of radiation measurement, and asked him if he could get a hold of this Speedy data so that he could run some computer analysis. He had a colleague who was at the NASA Goddard Space Center that was doing something comparable to atmospheric modeling, and they were going to use this data to do their own kind of analysis. And he was very surprised that Kan Suzuki did not even know that Speedy exists. He talked to his staff, and he got back to him a couple of days later, and he said, well, we have Speedy, but we're not actually using it. Eventually, this became a much larger issue, but I think the way this made it into the general public initially was through Hayano twittering about this, and he went from several hundred to tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of followers as a result. Shows the influence of mass media and social media on this. Eventually, Hayano was concerned about this and was paying for the testing of school lunches up in Minamisoma out of his own pocket because the government did not have this in their pre-existing budgets. Eventually, they were able to do that. But one of the issues that has come out in the Speedy issue is that the government did not really use Speedy because they didn't have the sufficient data. And they argued that they didn't have enough data to make a reliable conclusion. This is data that came originally out of the Daiichi plant itself. This is not Speedy, but it's something comparable to Speedy. It's basically the data assessment that was happening from the radiation monitoring post immediately around the Daiichi plant. And you can see here that this was meant to go to prefectural offices in Fukushima. And this was sent on the evening, very late in the morning, early in the morning of March 12th. I just have a couple of scans of this, but this is dozens of pages of information that they attempted to send out to the local communities. This is one of these issues that you just can't invent, but tragically and almost unbelievingly, they had not entered in the numbers into the fax, and they had a number that was going to send it out to all of these, and when they sent the fax out, it never went out. It never reached the local communities. They never actually received the data. So obviously, whether or not Speedy could have been properly used is still a controversy, but clearly there were problems of communication within the Japanese government, within TEPCO, and between these foreign entities. These are measurements that were coming from these fixed radiation monitoring posts, and you can see here that on March 15th, there's a very high spike. This was confirmed by the American Department of Energy's atmospheric monitoring readings that also revealed this spike. This is, I think, after Reactor 3 building outer structure exploded. Within a couple of days, the American government mobilized to Japan. Remember, these are General Electric plants that were built back in the 70s, and the United States had, after the war, had basically helped build the nuclear industry in Japan. There were a group of about 200 staff in the United States and a full-time team of 16 here in Japan, led by Charles Casto, that were in Japan trying to consult with the Japanese government, but also trying to acquire data for their own purposes. It's fascinating, and I recommend for you to go online on the NRC's website. You can find hundreds of pages of documents from Freedom of Information Act that have about 300 pages a day of phone conversations between the U.S. Embassy, the NRC, the American Pacific Command, and various federal agencies discussing this issue. Of course, for the United States NRC, the real issue that they were facing was the legacy of 3 Mile Island and whether or not they could maintain nuclear industry after a nuclear accident. This was a great concern for the viability, the long-term viability of nuclear energy in the United States. And the NRC started to debate with Japan about how bad this situation was. They were getting different readings than what Japan was providing them. This focused on the spent fuel pool of reactor building number 4. This is actually a slide from TEPCO, which shows that after the initial explosion of that building, there was an appreciable drop. TEPCO was claiming that that pool had never gone dry. And although eventually they were proven correct in that, you can see that all the way into the end of April, that was declining to the point where by the end of April, before they recovered, they almost lost containment within that pool. It meant that it was leaking. And it's no surprise when you look at the condition of this building. It's kind of amazing that that pool did survive. It blew out the outer structure. This is the spent fuel pool, as it is in normal operations. And this is on the top floor of the building. So this is what that building looked like after it was blown out. So it's really quite amazing that that pool did stay in containment. The United States, using surveillance helicopters, satellites, other forms of data acquirement, doing infrared scans, saw what they thought were fires coming out in the building of Reactor 3 and Reactor 4. And they believed that that meant that spent fuel pool 4 was dry. The United States government started doing their atmospheric modeling, which was their version of SPEEDY, which is called RASCAL. It's a radiological assessment system. And the results that they were getting were really quite alarming. Now, we don't have time to go into this in any detail in this presentation, but you can look this up. These are called source term analyses. And it's basically a computer model that makes an estimation of how much radiological materials are released into the atmosphere after a nuclear accident. These are very sophisticated mathematical algorithms, but they are not actual radiation measurements. These are estimates based upon a variety of variables. And what they found was, it was very alarming, but there was a great deal of disagreement on these issues. They also found that some of the data analysis that they had here was not really very sufficient. The model that they had in the United States, again, this is America's version of SPEEDY, did not account for a multiple reactor release. It did not account for a multiple day release. It didn't really account for spent fuel pools. And you can kind of reverse engineer from how they've revised the RASCAL system now to all the things that they couldn't do during the accident, and there are many things that they really couldn't do. But the United States government, because they didn't really feel like they were getting sufficient information from TEPCO, started doing their own radiation assessment. And they brought in the Department of Energy's atmospheric monitoring system. These were planes that did several hundred hours of flyovers in which they were doing radiological assessment. And from this, they were acquiring data that indicated that the levels at 50 miles were in excess of protective action guidelines that are set out by the U.S. Department of Energy. These are also based upon the International Committee of Radiological Protection, which are international standards for short-term releases. As a result of this, the United States government decided that they needed to evacuate out various Department of Defense dependents. And about 7,800 military personnel, these were families and dependents of American personnel, were taken out of Japan on emergency evacuation flights around March, in the period between March 20th and March 21st. There was a period of time going all the way up to March 21st where the Americans were making plans to put everyone on the deck of aircraft carriers to get them out of Japan. They thought for a period of several days that as many as 170,000 Americans were going to be leaving Japan. I talked to the mayor of Yokosuka, and he was very concerned about the U.S. Navy leaving and whether or not they would come back because their economy is dependent on them. This is a story that I tell through my papers, but of course I'm not the only one who's told this story. I particularly recommend a book by David Lockman called Fukushima, The Story of a Nuclear Disaster, which analyzes these government documents quite thoroughly. But what I want to talk about now is the larger issue of how we communicate and how we conceive of radiation. This is a model coming out of the philosophy of science in my field in sociology. This is a kind of theoretical analysis of how people conceive of issues in what's called discourse analysis. The central concept here is the concept of paradigms. A paradigm is like a worldview or a way of looking at things. You could call it a theoretical perspective or an analytical frame of mind. Various disciplines have different theoretical paradigms. This is a concept that originally was used by a philosopher of science by the name of Thomas Kuhn. And I want to apply this to the issue of how different organizations, including government or state actors, NGOs, anti-nuclear groups, regular citizens, and the media, all conceive of radiation in quite different ways. So here's some of the radiological paradigms that I'm identifying. In the scientific realm, the two major paradigms are called the linear no-threshold model. This is a scientific paradigm that argues that any amount of radiation going all the way down to zero will have some sort of health effect. There's a debate on this about just at what level low-level radiation really causes damage. That competes with another paradigm or another model called radiation hormesis. This argues that actually a small amount of radiation is positive because it stimulates the immune system, it somehow stimulates cell regeneration, and that a small or low levels of radiation are actually positive. This is not the dominant paradigm, but it is a scientific perspective that has a lot of peer-reviewed research to support it. These are scientific paradigms that debate within the field of radiological protection. Above and beyond that, outside these government authorities, we have the anti-nuclear paradigm. And the anti-nuclear paradigm argues that any amount of radiation is unacceptable. And obviously, that is very much inconsistent with the way the governments deal with these issues, and that helps explain many of the controversies that have been documented today. Ultimately, the way that governments deal with this is they make kind of pragmatic adjustments in which they compromise between what the public will accept, what electoral politics will sustain, and what the scientific community tells them is correct. And even within government organizations, even among radiological experts, there is not a great deal of consensus on these issues. And we saw this in the Fukushima disaster. Those evacuation or exclusionary zones, 30 kilometers, 50, 80 kilometers, 300 kilometers, those are coming out of government-level organizations with scientific experts who are disagreeing on just how bad this accident is. Kuhn makes the argument that between competing paradigms, there's something that he calls incommensurability. The concept here is that these perspectives are so profoundly different that people can't really effectively communicate. That's because they have no common measure, they have no common way of evaluating. They have different assumptions, different priorities, different vested interest, and in some cases, different political ideologies that drive their interpretation. Kuhn's argument is that as a result of this, we really can never reach a consensus on these issues. Now, note that Kuhn is not talking in any way about radiological issues here, radiation. This predates that, really. He's talking more broadly within the scientific and philosophical traditions. He was talking about cosmology or origins of the universe, not really in this realm, but this can be applied to the Fukushima disaster and the level of miscommunication and the lack of consensus that can be reached over time on these issues. There are a number of different kinds of incommensurability. The methods that we use, the observations that we make, the language that we use. At the simplest level, just simply using REMS or microsieverts, but also in different languages and different ways in which people are measuring radiation. These are all very, very different. But the one insight I think that Kuhn makes that is very interesting is that we often think in terms of having our facts straight, having our facts objective. Kuhn would say that that's naive, that ultimately our facts are based upon our theories, and our theories are based upon our facts. And beyond that, our values are implicit in our theories. You might think of this as running in all directions, that basically all theories are value-laden, but all values are theory-laden, and all facts are value-laden. All of these things are very much related to the values and biases that people have. And so Kuhn argues that it's very difficult to come to an unbiased objective truth because we have these different assumptions and different priorities and different vested interests. Within the nuclear industry, they use a principle called ALARA, which means as low as reasonably achievable. This is a kind of political compromise between what the public will accept and what the industry demands, of trying to maintain nuclear energy even when you have a public that is often very threatened by it and very worried about it. and in some cases trying to stop it. It's also based upon the recognition that it's virtually impossible to have nuclear plants and not have radiological releases. ALARA is, I think, a good example of how governments end up trying to compromise between these competing paradigms as a way of pragmatically keeping these industries running. But ultimately, I think we have to keep in mind that at the end of the day, our theories need to be tested. And one thing that I very much appreciate about the citizen radiation groups and the citizens activist groups, including SafeCast, I see Asby Brown here in the audience, is that these organizations are trying to supplement and counter what the government is offering, because the government has lost a lot of its authority and a lot of its trust. At the end of the day, we really have to subject our theories to very strict tests. I want to point you towards the work of Sir Karl Popper, who has a notion of what he calls falsifiability, that ultimately any scientific test has to stand up to the scrutiny of allowing its theories to be proven wrong. And Karl Popper makes the argument that often, rather than allowing our theories to be subject to a real, genuine test and allow ourselves to be proven wrong, that we take a defensive posture and just try to justify ourselves, adjust our theories, and end up never really allowing ourselves to be proven wrong. We see this in the way in which the government tests for radiation, the way in which, when they're challenged, they will make adjustments but never really admit that they're wrong. But I also want to point out that the conclusions or implications of what he is arguing really run in both directions. That this notion of falsifiability is not just something that we have to hold state-level actors accountable for, but also among other people who are outside those institutions that are trying to fight against the government in the anti-nuclear movement. That at the end of the day, we do have to rely on something like science, or something that allows ourselves to come to more determinate conclusions instead of standing on political ideology. And one thing that I found very interesting in interviewing some 200 people in the last several years is that I think for the most part people are trying to do their best. I know that most anti-nuclear activists would not think that government officials or military or organizational people are doing anything but lying or somehow dissembling. But at the end of the day, I think everyone is trying to get to some measure of the truth here, but ultimately governments end up being compromised by the fact that they cannot maintain these nuclear plants without exposing people to some kind of risk. And I think ultimately what we end up doing in this is we often play a kind of blame game where we're looking for enemies. I have a colleague that works in the American media industry in ABC News, and he says their first principle when they come up with the story is, who do we blame? If we don't have a story, if we don't have someone to blame, we don't have a story. And often that's the way we psychologically make sense of these kind of disasters, is focusing on someone to blame. I would argue that ultimately what happened in this nuclear crisis is that an entire system, a regulatory structure, a governmental structure, and the way in which that system has operated for the last generation was exposed for being dysfunctional. This accident has revealed that that system has real problems, and I applaud the efforts of these groups like the organizations that's organizing this conference today, because I think ultimately Japan needs a more active civil society. It needs to have citizens involved in democracy to try to have a real conversation about these issues. And I think one thing that has happened as a result of this nuclear accident is that we have reconsidered whether or not we can believe what authorities tell us on these issues. And now the challenge that we're pushing at them for them to justify their actions and to demonstrate that they're keeping people safe, and particularly now as they're talking about the restarts of reactors in Sendai and in the future, that the government officials are held accountable on these issues. And I think that if nothing else, there needs to be more communication in both directions between these various parties. I'm out of time, and we can pick this up in the Q&A. Thank you.
ここで主催者から皆様にお願い申し上げます。撮影なんですが、事前に何回もご注意申し上げていますけれども、主催者の許可された方以外はですね、撮影はできないことになっておりますので、以後撮影はやめてください。それからツイッターにですね、無断でこ 主催者に無断でアップされている方いますけれども、ツイッターは直ちに削除してください。よろしくお願いします。
クリブランドさん、どうもありがとうございます。それで、ここ12時で、セッション1を終える予定だったんですけども、少し、押してしまったので、少し、質問の方届いていますので、Q&A をやって、それで少し、昼食の時間が短くなってしまうんですけども、12時半くらいまでかな、それ30分くらいはできるかなと思ってます。質問の方、もしありましたら、スタッフが今、会場回ってますので、こちらの方にお渡しいただければと思います。いくつかすでにご質問いただいていて、この2つ、ジョバンさんと影浦さんに来ている質問、これちょっと2つ読みますね。これちょっと共通点があるなと考えているんですけども、まず、ジョバンさんへの質問で、フランスで同じような大事故が起こったら、政府はしっかり住民を避難させるでしょうか。日本よりはマシな対応が期待できますか。個人的な意見としては、あまり変わらないだろうとは考えてるんですけど、それはクリティックの側の市民社会がより強いからでしょうか。というのが一つの質問と、あと、影浦先生に質問で、その茶番の暴走に私たち市民社会の側は飲み込まれている状況のように思います。もしそうだとして、この状況に抗うキーは何だと思われるでしょうかというのが質問なんですけども、ジョバンさんの先ほどのご発表の中で、このニュークリアガバナンスとニュークリアクリティックっていうお話があったんですけども、はい。
はい、ご質問ありがとうございます。何語で、日本語でいいですか？日本語でいいですか？どっちでもいいです。はい。フランスの市民社会の反応は、要するに同じ事故って、まず、全く同じ事故の可能性っていうのは、まずないと思うんです。フランスはもう地震の可能性が少ないし、津波もまずないんですが、もちろん似たような同じスケールの、事故は十分あり得ると思うんですね。で、私はなぜ原発労働者の研究してきたかというと、それは私のもう一人のフランスの、社会学者の影響でアニ・テボモニさんという先生ですけども、彼女はちょうど2000年にフランスの原発労働者について本を出版したんですけれども、ちょうど私その頃博士号研究日本で博士号研究をし始めた頃なんですが、で彼女の影響でこの研究をし始めたんですが、彼女の仮説はフランスの原発事故の可能性が別にこういった自然災害の影響で起こり得る可能性がもちろんあるんですけれども、最もあり得るのはその原発の中から、さっき私の発表で申し上げたんですけども、その定期検査の期間がね、どんどん短くなってきたっていう、もうだいぶ前から、もうこれは2000年の段階でこういう3ヶ月間から50日間以下に収めるように、そのマネジメントからの圧力で、そのレーバーコスト、人的資源のコストを少なくするために、そういったマネジメント経営的な圧力で、変わってきたんですね。それに対する市民社会の反応っていうのは、まず例えば彼女が先生が2000年この本を出版したんですけども、まず報道はほとんどなかったし、それに対する市民社会の関心がほとんどなかった。で、ようやくおかげさんって言ってしまうと、福島事故のおかげでようやく市民社会の関心が少し高まってきたっていう だけど、残念ながらね、もう
It's been almost 4 years since the accident. The interest is actually waning now again. So there are waves and fluctuations of the level of interest of the civil society that we are definitely observing. When it comes to the comparison between France and Japan, well, both nations have a movement of the civil society. And when it comes to the nuclear governance of these countries, when it comes to the nuclear governance activities, both in France and in Japan, I believe we can both call this activism as well. And in that sense, we are seeing the resurgence of the nuclear governance activism in both countries. Well, in France, there is an internal political situation where the Social Party has surged, and that has led to moving away from the nuclear activities and nuclear power generation. We need to lessen the dependence of nuclear power generation. That has been the movement since the emergence of the Social Party. However, despite such political movement, we are seeing a resurgence yet again of the nuclear power side as well. And I hope that the civil society in France would do more to fight against this, and I'm doing my best. And I think the only thing I can do is to do best, to do whatever we can. Additional question to Professor Jobin from myself. In France, when you talk about the pro-nuclear power or nuclear power promoter, there's, I believe, the government, politicians, the scientists, etc. But who is actually governing these people? Who's governing the nuclear governance? Well, governance of the governance. Who is governing the nuclear governance? Very good question. There is an authority in France, the Nuclear Safety Authority in France. It's called ASN, and there are about 100 people working within this agency and who are in charge of nuclear governance. The major the energy company in France is called EDF. There is Areva, the nuclear industry company, and all these companies are regulated and governed under ASN. And again, as I said, 100 people approximately work within this agency. And there is a new research institution on the safety of nuclear and radiation. So it's a dedicated research institution. That actually institute has about 2,000 researchers and has actually a tremendous amount of budget. But in their case, that research institution is definitely promoting on the promoter side. Basically, no criticism whatsoever from their side. After March 11th, there was been some whistleblowers activities. Well, it's not really a whistleblowers, but has been some debates and disagreements, which actually highlighted the fact that there are people, there's sociologists and other researchers and scientists who have different opinions. For example, a particular sociologist in France, a lady, said that there has been definitely a disagreement within the society. And when it comes to the confidence level towards this nuclear research institution, it has been waned. In fact, this research institution is merely a voice of propaganda for the nuclear promoter and the government. If that is the case, there will be less confidence level among the general public in France. Something must be done. This is what she has said. So gradually, from internal within the international organization, there has been more and more voices of dissent in terms of papers disagreeing or research is undertaken. The control actually from the regulation is quite strong, which means that there are very few still of these kind of criticisms.
第一にしどりまこさんがご発表の一番最初になさった一番最後になさったご提案を真剣に一人一人ちゃんと聞くことで、例えばツイッターで書くだけじゃなくてツイッターで書いたらそれに関連する報道機関に連絡をして丁寧にそれはどうなんでしょう。ただ私自身はとても悲観的なので今そのレベルで抵抗力はもうなくなっちゃってるのかなという感じがします。それでしばらく前にかなり考えた上で極めて限られた形というのを私は大学の中にお持ちしているんですが、極めて限られた形で言語の義務拘束性を立て直す言葉を使って私たちがおよそものを考える議論をするというか、私はこう思う、僕はこう思うというのとどう違うということを改めて捉え直してそれを伝えていきたい。自分でも考えるように伝えていきたいなと。少し一歩引いたところでもう一度立て直しの足場を作ろうというふうに思いいろいろやっている。これは極めて私自身の置かれた場所での個人的なことですけれども、それをできるだけマッコさんのおっしゃられたご提案を実践しつつ、
in order for us to implement Mako-san's recommendation, I would like to review carefully the meaning and binding nature of language. This may not be a strong point. I hope that that is all right with you. One more question for Kageura-san. Risk can only be used when there are options, but it is actually a threat if it is not up to the individual to make a choice. You need to have the right resolution, and I think that it actually makes the distinction very appropriately, so I would like to use that in the forward. In a lawsuit, so the relationship between a risk and a threat. Think about Ikeda Elementary School. There was an 0157 bacteria school lunch lawsuit. Children are forced to eat the school lunch. They have no other option, which means that the school lunch provider has to be that much more cautious. So if you look carefully at the lawsuit, then the risk and the hazard are distinguished. You hear often that the risk of an automobile accident may be the same, but in an automobile accident, the aggressor and the victim could be different, or the perpetrator can. It is possible to mitigate the risk due to cares taken by the individuals, and the effects of the accident itself are not long-standing. Whereas in the case of a nuclear accident, the perpetrator and the victim will not change sides, and the effects of the accident are very long-standing. So to talk about the nuclear accident and an automobile accident within the same dialogue, then I believe that we need to be very careful about distinguishing risk and hazard, and that will help to clarify things for the victim. The Agriculture Ministry website talks about risk communication. There's a beginner's guidebook for risk communication, which has been published by the US CDC, Center for Disease Control. In the 1980s, I believe, there was communication science, which was popular in the 80s, and from that theory, they are providing various examples on how best to go about risk communication and some actual practices. So it is all lined out in a summary. The current risk communication appears to be very frail. Risk is used when there are options. So the premise is that if the premise is that one is to accept that, then I believe that we have to be very careful about that because this could be a different context. Earlier, we looked at the Education Ministry's website about, I think that this was a statement in 1981 by Mr. Fishoff that there are certain elements that affect risk, and it's a bullet point here. I would like to read this. Risk that seems to be voluntary is easier to accept. If it is a risk that one feels one has control over, then compared to a risk that others are administering, it is easier to accept. If there is clearly profit in a risk, then it is easier to accept compared to something where there is absolutely no profit. So if you listen to that, then thinking about Chernobyl or the Ethos project, in coexisting with radiation, and if you have no other options, that's the reason why we are facing this current situation. It is very similar to the type of risk communication that is happening. So in the absence of other options, how do you make that option more palatable? I believe that that's a dangerous discussion to be having, and I think that it's very problematic. Could we ask for your thoughts? Well, everything is exactly as you say. There is nothing more for me to add. I think that the way that you outlined it was very clear. Yes. I think I maybe spoke too much. So, Joban-san? I agree, yes. Risk communication, I've been working in the field of environmental psychology, and I've started to hear that phrase, but even pre-3/11, there have been asbestos issues or dioxin, and it's been a word that you would hear in the environment. In Japanese, you hear the word risku communication a lot, used in katakana, and it was never very clear to me. And after March 11, after I listened to Kageura-san's presentation, it made a lot of sense to me. It depends on who is defining risk. So rather than that coming from sociologists, if that could be based on your observations and your discerning point of view, I think that we need to be a bit more critical. And Professor Cleveland, perhaps you have a different point of view. At least it seemed to me that you may have a different take on this from your presentation in terms of risk.
I think there's a big difference between academic discourses
で行われている話と、そして専門家の話とリスクについては全く違うと思います。例えば科学ではこちらすべてのキャリアを通じて研究していましたけれども、私どもほとんど全員にとっての問題というのは 3.11、2011年の初めからかかってきました。そして私たち自身これを勉強しようと化してきたわけです。リ リスクに対処する際、私たちが語っているのはコミュニケーションであり、そして一般国民の恐れ、そして認識、そして情報であり、政府組織がいかに伝えるのかということが対象になります。その結果として願わくば、もっとこの問題についての啓蒙が行われればと思っております。確かに悲劇ではありました。もっと私たちとしてマスコミに心を配り、そして有名人に対しても考えなければなりませんが、基本的に私たちの生活がかかっているわけです。日本の公立学科ではかなり科学的な教育が行われております。こういった問題についてしかしながらもっと教育すべきです。放射線、そしてその与える影響についても語られてしかるべき。一般的に一つ、この悲劇から得るべきはいかに私たちが知らないのかということを認識すべきということです。今起こっていることについてもよく分かっていません。この原子力発電所は何十年も運営されてきました。突然3.11から2011年に安全でなくなったわけではないのです。この大災害のあったこの問題については随分検証の目が向けられており、改めて認識しただけで実は基盤となる問題というのはずっと存在していたということです。特に規制体制というのがきちんと厳しい目にさらされていなかったという点が問題であると思います。NGO、そして組織団体の中でも非科学的、また非政府関連、また権威と関係のないところ、私たち一般的市民が立ち上がって何が起こっているのか鋭い目を向けるということが必要であり、それがあって初めて意味のある議論ができると思います。今になって初めてそれができ始めていると思いますが、これは今まず端緒に立ったばかりで、もっともっとコミュニケーションを図るべきと考えます。
ありがとうございます。あと他の
Thank you very much. Any other comments or questions? Actually, I have a question. This is raised to Oshidori Mako-san. One of the questions to you is that at the Unit 1, there are any overseas workers working as the decontaminator? Because there is an information that Vietnamese who worked as a decontaminator at the Unit 1, for example, in 2011, the Japanese Brazilian worked at the high pay, hourly pay of 30,000 Japanese yen, and I saw such an advertisement, job seeking advertisement, but is that true? That's true. There are foreign workers at the Fukushima NPP quite a lot, including Brazilian people, Portuguese, Asian people. And then, what is the ratio of the total workers? How much is the ratio of overseas workers? And I have asked this question to TEPCO all the time. However, I have not received any answer from TEPCO at all as to the nationalities. They just said that everything is up to the subcontractors, and TEPCO does not have an intention to grasp the situation, and the reason is very strange because TEPCO insists that if they inquire that it may the violation or it may lead to the discrimination based on the nationality, and that is the rationale that TEPCO does not inquire the ratio of the overseas workers. However, there is a language barrier, and although all of them are really diligent, for example, there is a kanji character open and close, and the SOP and for foreign workers, it's difficult to distinguish the kanji characters between open and close. This is one of the language problems. Another problem is that if the foreign workers are exposed to a certain level of dose, for example, for Japanese workers, if the exposure level exceeds 100 millisievert, under the Japanese applicable laws and regulations, Japanese workers can take the health examinations. However, the TEPCO says that as to the security and safety of foreign workers, they are under their homeland regulations and laws. Therefore, they are not necessarily going through the medical health checkups. The other question is that are there any pressures on you from your agency? And if you identify your followers, so-called followers, can you please tell the number of that? Yes, I belong to the Yoshimoto Creative Agency, and the pressure from the agency, it's not the pressure per se, rather I would say voluntary restriction. For example, I was told by the manager that I had to reduce all of the assignments. Therefore, I don't know the relationships between the official pressure and voluntary restraint from the work. You see that at one point I had to consider the quit or resignation from the Yoshimoto agency. However, if I was resigned due to the coverage of the nuclear power plant, and Yoshimoto would be criticized quite a lot. Therefore, they could not stress me. And when we have a voluntary event, there is a discount for the public investigation agency, and you said that you are official from the public security agency, you can enjoy the discount. Okay. You see, the official from the public security intelligence agency, if you identify yourself from the official as official of the PSIA, you can enjoy the discount today. Okay, thank you very much. Now I'd like to get a break for lunch. And the afternoon session will start at 1:45. So please come back here at 1:45 as to the film taking or picture filming. Please refrain from taking pictures. However, there is no restriction for you to tweet about this event. Therefore, please tweet as much as possible you want. Thank you very much for your attention, and make sure to come back here at 1:45. Thank you very much.